We're now continuing our interval practice, focusing around this A note, which is on the 5th fret, and we're talking about the one that's on the bottom, the thin string of the guitar on the high-pitched E string on the bottom of the guitar. Now, as we do our intervals around this note, we are going to be basically in the Aeolian mode, otherwise known as the minor scale, and it's going to be really useful to practice the intervals from the bottom down here because it helps us to build chords around notes as we look from the bottom string up to the top, which people usually are not good at, because remember, the general way that people learn chords, if you look up, like if you just do the simple YouTube search, right, and you try to find different things, how are most people teaching how to learn the chords? Well, you're going to learn the chords in open position typically, and those are going to be what a lot of people are calling cowboy chords that you can play around the fire. Those are great. Those are some of the most fun things to do. And then we typically learn to move those chords up the guitar using what is often called a caged system, taking the symmetry of the shape and moving it up the guitar, which helps us also to visualize the guitar, naming those positions on the guitar from the shape that is being covered, noting that the shape conveniently covers 4 to 5 frets. Why? Because that's how the guitar is designed, so that we can reach things within 4 to 5 frets. So it's not a coincidence that we can nice and neatly, or fairly neatly, cut the guitar into 5 sections that line up to our 4 fingers approximately, because that's what they tried to do. So that's what we often do. So then we move up the guitar, naming the shapes possibly with the caged system, and then we start to really focus on 2 chord constructions when we move up the guitar, that being if I'm on the top string, if I'm looking from the top string, it'd be in the E major shape. So if I had an E major chord down here and I moved it up to right, like up here somewhere, E major bar chord, or the E minor. If I had the E minor, I use the E minor. Those are our bar chords. So you might not even hear them called an E minor shape or an E shape. You're just going to hear it called a bar chord from the top, a major bar chord or a minor bar chord, and that's basically moving up the shape of an E major or E minor. And on the 2nd string, we learned the A shape, which would be an A shape looking like that. We move it up here. That would be our bar chord on the 2nd string, or an A minor shape, which would be a minor shape here. So boom. So that's what we typically learn, right? We learn, okay, I know my open positions. I'm going to move up the fretboard. I really only need 2 shapes to really play everything I need to, at least in terms of triad chords. That being the bar chords on the top of the string, which are going to be the major and minor bar chords, which are basically moving up from a caged perspective. Again, the E major and E minor. And on the bottoms, on the 2nd string down, I learn the bar chords from the 2nd string, the A string, which are going to be an A major and A minor bar chords. So, and then that allows me to move up the guitar by just basically knowing the notes on the top 2 strings. And all of the strings below it then are just kind of along for the ride, right? I don't even know what's really happening down there. I just know this top string is an A, and I play that bar chord, which is a minor bar chord, and boom, all the rest of the strings line up. Okay, that's great. But what if I want to play like something at the bottom of the guitar, just like a triad chord? Why would I want to do that? Because it sounds different, right? It sounds different, and these big bar chords aren't going to be as good when you're trying to layer things on top of each other, because someone else is already playing this heavy E string, such as the bassist if you're in a band or you're trying to play multiple tracks on top of each other. Therefore, you'll find a lot more utility. You'll be a lot more versatile. You can do a lot more things and play with a lot more people if you can play in different registers on the guitar. Therefore, learning the bottom of the guitar is quite useful. Easiest way to construct chords is, one, you can just take the shape apart and say, what's the bottom of that shape? And I can try to figure it out down here and say, well, there's a little A kind of there because that's the bottom of the bar chord. But that's not perfect. That's not the greatest way to do that, because if I just say this is the bottom of the bar chord, like I can't really know that if it actually has the notes in it that fill the requirements if I don't know the actual relative positions. Like I can see that that's the bottom of the bar chord, but without me being able to look at which note is the A and what's the fifth and the third related to it, I might not be able to know that that still fills all the requirements, has a 1, 3, 5 of the minor chord. Whereas if you learn the intervals, you can build not just the shapes that happen to be there from the bottom of the bar chord, but any basic shape from the bottom here. So that's kind of what we're working on. Why can't people do this well? Because they can't say the musical alphabet forwards and backwards too easily, and they can't recognize the notes on the bottom of the guitar as easily as the top two strings, which we can help us by looking at it by shape, and we can't measure intervals from the bottom of the guitar as easily as looking at top to bottom, because we always just practice top to bottom, or most of us do. Again, if you look at tablature and you've learned guitar like from tablature, you might start looking at the guitar from top to bottom because that's how you read, and for some reason they flip the tablature upside down, which always drives me crazy. It's like, I don't want to look at the little string on top. That's not how I look at the guitar from behind the guitar, personally. Maybe I'm a little dyslexic, maybe I'm a little weird on that, but I don't think I'm totally weird. I think that's like normal. But you probably have a lot of worksheets that have the little string on the top of the guitar, and you might have learned from top to bottom like that, right? But I think most people don't, right? So that becomes a problem. And if I learn the intervals from the bottom of the guitar, I have to look at the inverse distance. And so that's a little bit messy. And the fault line, this part of the guitar shifts forward. So there's a difference in the tuning between these two strings. That's a problem. Most people don't even know how to count between the strings. So most people don't even, and I'm not trying to criticize here, because the guitar, we learn the guitar by shape, right? So I didn't know that, like, until when I was learning guitar, I wanted to learn the shapes and move all the shapes around. So I wasn't sitting here counting the intervals either, even though I'm an accountant messing with a guitar. But it's highly useful to know the distance from position to position, whereas on a piano, you're gonna do that all the time. Like if you played on the piano, it would be like one string on the guitar that just keeps on repeating over and over into higher or lower octaves, depending on which way you are going. And therefore you're gonna start to really see, oh, I see the intervals clearly. This is the 1, 3, 5, because I'm playing on one string in essence, and that becomes very clear. But when you're on the guitar playing on multiple strings, then that isn't as clear. What is clear is the shape. You're like, oh, I recognize that shape. That's what makes sense. But if I could recognize the distances, then that would make it easier. How do I do that? Well, I need to know the distance between the guitar from string to string, so that I can measure how long the distance is, and I need to know what the intervals actually mean, right? When I say it's a third, it could be a major third is 4 notes away, a minor third is 3 notes away. Again, on a guitar, most people don't think like that. What do? They say, oh, the shape looks like this for a major, like the third is like that for a minor, and like this for a major, right? I know the shape, but I can't tell you how far away in notes those two strings are, right? So it'd be easier if I could count it out and tell you. I could prove it, right? I could say, well, why is that? Well, it's just the shape. Well, that's one way of proving it, but I'd also like to be able to say it's 4 notes away. That's what makes a major, which again, on a piano, the piano players intuitively know that. You could see it. It's obvious because it's on the same string, right? If I do it on the same string, it's obvious, right? Okay. So that's going to be our general practice, remembering that the minor, this is basically the Aeolian, which is the minor scale. And we have a tendency in Western music to disassociate the major and the minor as though they're two separate scales that do two different things, and they're not actually modes related to all the other modes, but they are modes related to all the other modes. So we kind of want to keep that in mind. I'm going to try to go in a little bit as I go into my intro here, and before we get into the intervals, describe some of the concepts I've been thinking about from the prior couple presentations, where we were looking at the major modes, in particular the Mixolydian mode, asking the question, why would I want to learn the Mixolydian mode if I want to play mainly in the major scale and minor scale, right? That's one question. And another question would be, how can I move through like a 1, 4, 5 progression in Mixolydian, adding like the 7 if the 7 isn't in each of the progressions. And we came to the concept of, well, you can either kind of move through the progression as though you're going to be playing the same shape, which means you're going to be outside the key in the same shape, or you can be inside the key, but then the shape's going to change. So those are the two kind of choices that we had. And then we started to think, well, I can apply that concept possibly even outside all the major notes, which we saw in Mixolydian, because the 1, 4, and the 5 of the Mixolydian isn't even a major scale, it's a minor scale. So what we did is we jumped to the 1, 4, 5 and made it a Mixolydian 1, Mixolydian 4, Mixolydian 5. We just converted it to Mixolydian on the 1, 4, 5, right? And then we started saying, well, we could do that even on the ones that aren't majors then. I could start visualizing myself in this shape, but then I can start using kind of rules as to when I can break the rules, right? And I compare that to, like, again, if you're in grade school and your well-meaning teacher keeps telling you all these rules that you can't say this or do that, but then when you say this or do that and you do it the wrong way, like, we was robbed, right? We was robbed, right? It's like, well, that saying kind of became somewhat well known for a time period. Why? Because he said it wrong. If he said we were robbed, then no one would remember what he said, right? But you get some attention if you say we was robbed, right? I mean, so you can break the rules on purpose, hopefully, right? Knowingly break the rules, and that probably wasn't a knowing breaking up. That was just the way he talks, right? But those are just conventions, like wherever he was from or whatever. Whoever said that, I think it was in a boxing match or something. But the idea is you can break the rules on purpose, and that's going to draw attention to it. Similarly with music, we're saying, okay, we're in key here. You got to play everything in key. We've got all these chords that we will construct that are in the same key. But you want to break. When can you break the rules? Breaking the rules is like saying we was robbed. It's going to draw attention, and the question is, is it good attention or bad attention, right? And that's dependent in part on taste, right? Someone's going to say he sounds like he's ignorant or something, and other people are going to say, well, it sounded cool or whatever, right? And that's just how it works, right? But the question is, in terms of practice, is like, when can we kind of break the rules? So I want to kind of apply that same concept a little bit more on the minor scales now that we're on them. So remember the general rule. If I go up top here, we've got normally the major scale is just the Ionian mode from a modal structure, and then we can compare all of the other major scales to them, that being the Lydian and the Mixolydian. They only have one interval difference. And then we can look at the mode that's opposite or the most different from the Ionian, and that should be, in theory, the Aeolian, which is the minor scale, right? Because you're saying the major is on one side, you would think that the minor scale would be completely opposite, as different as possible, have as many intervals different as possible, you would think, right? And well, that's the general idea. Now, it's not really the case in practice, because the minor doesn't actually have a minor second, whereas the Phrygian does. So the Phrygian is actually the most opposite, it seems to me, from the major, but the minor is the one that we use most often, so that's the one we want to compare to. And it's a good comparison, because once I learn the intervals of the minor, I can compare the other two minors to it, which is the Dorian and the Phrygian, which will only have one interval difference. Now remember, why is this useful to do? It's useful to do, of course, if you want to be playing in different modes, because if I'm in the Aeolian, if I'm in the major scale, then I would like to be able to play in Dorian, or in our case now, the Aeolian, which is the minor scale. And so I need to know this to some extent, of course, simply to play basically in a minor scale, so I can play something different. But as I do that, I don't want to think about it as I'm doing a totally different thing. I'm just playing the same notes as some related major. In this case, the minor A minor happens to be the same notes as its related C major. I'm just really focusing around a new central point, that being the A, that's going to be like the tonic. So that's going to be the general idea. So then as I go through, like if I'm playing in C major, then like we say, I think it's most common like in the blues when you start adding the 7 that you start to see, okay, if I go to the 1, 4, 5, then all I really need to know is those are major keys if I only play the 1, 3, 5 of the chord, the 1, 3, 5 of the C, the 1, 3, 5 of the F, the 1, 3, 5 of the G. But if I start adding the 7, it's going to get messy because now I'm recognizing that the 7, the 1 has a major 7, the 4 has a major 7, but the 5 has a minor 7. So now that brings the question of what do I want to do in that case? Do I want to play the same 7 on the 1, 4, 5, all major 7s or all minor 7s, which will give me the same shape on the guitar, but we're going to lose the fact that it's going to be in the same key. So that's the trade-off that we're kind of working with. So do I want to play something parallel shape-wise, or do I want to stay in the same key? And you might alter between the two as you're kind of doing the same thing, right? It's going to come up with a different sound. The blues tends to lean towards, in my opinion, the shape being the same, and then sacrificing the fact that you're going out of key, right? But it still sounds good because the parallelness of the shape is my general take on that. So then let's apply that same concept. So that means if I go to the 4 and the 5, how do I know when the 7 is a major 7 or a minor 7? Well, and the same is with the 9, the 11, and the 13, which is equivalent to the 2, 4, and 6, the evens that we skip. If I want to add those to a chord or some kind of rip that's in the 1, 4, 5 progression, how do I know when I get to the 4 or the 5 which ones I can add if it's not just going to align up to a major chord and a minor chord from the perspective of just the 1, 3, 5, right? And the way we do that is we could say it's basically a modal chord. We could say, well, what I'm playing, I'm usually going to be playing something in some kind of modal chord. So the Lydian is taking all of the same notes, but putting it in terms of the Lydian, right? Counting every other note from the perspective of the F that is in the key. And you come up with a Lydian. So if you know that, then you're going to start to know the intervals that are different and when you're going to be playing something out of key or in the same key, right? So I think from a blues standpoint, like one way to approach it is if I didn't know that, right? If I don't know the stuff, what would I do? I'd say, well, I'm just going to do a parallel construction, right? And right here, and then I'm going to move the same shape up and down. And it might be out of key. I'm not really thinking of being in key, maybe, right? I'm just kind of guessing on what I would do and what I have done, right, in certain situations. Like, I'm not really thinking about being in the same key. I'm thinking that I'm on this shape and then I'm on the other shape that's similarly constructed, and the ear picks up on the fact that they have a similar construction. The intervals are the same distances away, even though they're not in the same key, right? I think that's kind of the gist of maybe like how your mind might be thinking when the bluesy thing came about, right? You start thinking, I'm just going to start building shapes that are the same from here to there. I go from this note to the next note, and then I play the same shape over it. I would think would be one way that you kind of start building on things. But that's the general idea. So let's look at the intervals. You have a perfect first, 2-note away major second, 4-note away major third, 5-note away perfect fourth, 7-note away perfect fifth, 9-note away major sixth, 11-note away major 7. If I compare that to the minor scale, otherwise known as the Aeolian mode, we would think that the perfects would remain the same as they do, and the minors would be flattened, meaning moved down a step. The majors would be flattened to a minor, which they are for the 3, 6, and 7, but not for the 2. The 2 still has a 2-note away major second. So that's how we can kind of memorize the minors. Now, the other thing we can kind of see on the minors, which I think most people do just naturally, is they say, well, on the minors, like with the major scale, the 1, 4, 5 happens to be the minor modes, which is great because now the 1, 4, 5, I can play kind of a blues in the major, which is, I can define, one way to define would be I play a 1, 4, 5 in a major scale, and then I can play the blues in a minor Aeolian scale, the minor scale, which is a 1, 4, 5, which has all the minors. So that's convenient that it works out that way. but it also kind of leads us to not really think about, well, how the major is related to the minor as much, right? So what I'm trying to do here is say, okay, I'd like to name the modes so I can see the relative positions as they compare to the major, right? So if I have the relative positions 1 through 7 of the minor, we start on Aeolian, which I'm going to call absolute mode number 6. So I'm going to call it a modal chord in essence, or it's a mode of the 6 related to the major, and that kind of helps me to see, well, what is the 3? What is the 4? Let's say, well, the 4 I know is a minor chord because again I have a 1 3 5 that I'm going to be building, and the third is minor, but I want to know that whether it's Dorian or Phrygian, basically, right? And I can kind of count it out by saying, well, if I'm looking at 3 notes down from here, what I'm going to do is take the 4 and say it's 3 notes down, 4 minus 1 is 3, and then we're going to add that to the mode that I started on, which is 6. So that'd be 6, 7, 8, 9. There's only 7 modes, only 7 notes in our scale. So 9 minus 7 is 2, mode number 2. Now I know that's a little tedious to do, but that helps us to identify that I'm really playing, when I play the Aeolian, I'm playing what I would call absolute mode number 6, Aeolian, absolute mode number 2, Dorian, to absolute mode number 3, the Phrygian. Why is that useful? Because now I know that the Dorian, I can go beyond, once again, the 1, 3, 5 to the 7, 9, 11, and 13. If I know the distinct intervals of the Dorian for the 7, 9, 11, 13, making the same kind of judgment call as to whether or not I want to play something that has parallel construction, which would be similar to me going to the 1, 4, 5, or in this case, the A chord to the D chord to the E chord, and either staying in the same key, which means I'm using the intervals for a Dorian chord and then a Phrygian chord, or do I want to go from the 1 to the 4 and switch it from a Dorian to an Aeolian? So instead of playing D Dorian, I'm going to play D Aeolian or D minor scale. Why does that matter? Well, it doesn't matter if you play the 1, 3, 5, but it's going to matter when you get out into the 7, 9, 11, and 13. In particular, the 6, which is equivalent to the 13, has a different one. On the Phrygian, it might be easier to see. When I get to the Phrygian, I can either play, when I get to the 5, which is what I would call absolute mode number 3 chord, right, which is the Phrygian mode, I can either play a Phrygian modal chord, or I can play a minor E minor. Why is that different? Well, the 2, which happens to be equivalent to the 9 in chord construction, has a flat 2, right? So it wouldn't matter if you are playing in Phrygian or Dorian if you didn't play the 9 in a chord standpoint or the 2 related to this E major. But if you do, if you build a chord that has that 2 in it, then you come up with the same question as we do in the blues construction with the 7, which is, again, do I want to build my chord that has parallel construction, switching the 5, which is mode number 3, Phrygian, to a minor E, or do I want to change the shape to accommodate the 2, or in this case, or the 9, right? And that means the shape will be different. Let me give you like an idea, a little bit of an idea of this. Like if I was on this A, right, and we're doing this in a minor construction, so this is one way to play the bar chord. Like here's the bar chord for an A minor. But if I take this bit, it's easier to see because you could see, like, let me do it this way here. So here's the root, and above it is the 5th, and then the 3rd is the one that we're really focused on because that's the difference between a major and a minor. If it was a major, we would have a 4-note away major 3rd versus a 3-note away minor 3rd, right? And so notice what would happen. Like one thing I can do here, of course, is I can do any half step I want. So if I was noodling around here, I can slide in to the note with a half step, and we saw before that I can slide in the whole chord even. Right, you can slide in the whole chord. So that tells us a couple ways we can break the rules, basically pulling in some of the notes that are in the white area, which is going to call some attention again, because now you've stepped outside the rules. You said we was robbed, right? And then if you take this and go back and say, well, what if I went to this G chord? This is a G chord with a parallel kind of construction right there on this G chord, and it would look like this because you have a flat, right? Now you have a flat here. And then if I brought it back to the F is a major chord in our, so if I stay within the lava, I don't go outside, I don't break the rules, it's right there, right? And so, so notice if I go back in a progression like that, I want my ear to be in A minor, G. I switched to be in the same key, F, major, and then maybe I go to E minor, back to A. But what would happen if I'm like, what if I said I want to be on the same construction? So I'm going to say, well, what if I just like forced this to a minor construction, right? I'm like, oh, what if I just like, I should be playing this, but I'm going to play it back here so it has a parallel construction. So I'm going to go from this shape on the A and just move the whole shape back. And I'm going to recognize it's out of key on the third, but I'm going to keep it parallel, right? So now it's like, and then E minor, and then maybe I add the major third because I'm going home. So notice that's a little wonky now, right? Because it's like I should be in the key of A, but then you played like a G minor, which should be a G major, and an F minor, which should be an F major, and then there's an E minor. That makes sense. But then you converted it to an E major. Why would I convert it to an E major? That's the traditional thing to do oftentimes because this one that's out of key leads home. Remember that leading tone. So switching the fifth, which in this case is an E, to a major is quite common. So that's like so those are a couple things just to keep in mind, right? So if I'm playing here, two ways I can do this. I'm in A minor to G major, F, E minor. That's in the same key versus, and then second time around, maybe I switch it up and do a parallel construction, go into the minors. G minor, E minor, E major. Sounds kind of Spanishy. That's the Spanish progression, by the way, where it's like goes to A minor, G major, to F major, to E major. That's the one that's out of key, but it leads back to the minor. You can play that progression this way, which is the fast one. But then if I do it the minors, so the other thing you can also kind of lead into the other thing I was kind of playing with is the half steps, right? So I was doing a half step like with that one note. But then the whole shape. But you could walk up chromatically up as well. So what if I just say this is my destination, but I'm going to walk up chromatically from like here and use the same shape, which totally doesn't fit in the key because these two notes don't fit, but I'm going to walk up home going half step, half step, half step. So instead of just going half step from here home, I'm going to go from here, right? And that kind of works even though like I started where these two notes aren't in the same key, and then I went up to here where this note isn't in the same key, and then these two notes aren't in the same key, but then I landed home. So because I walked up chromatically, even with the same, well, the whole shape is the same, it kind of works, you know, so if you're noodling around. So you can so those are just a couple ideas that are you know, ways that you might kind of break the rules a little bit and then make it sound a little, you know, which draws attention, right? People either like you or hate you when you draw attention. Like, oh, that was nice, and then other people's like, I'm gonna end you. I'm gonna end you right now for doing something outside the rules like that. That's not how we. Anyway, I'm gonna end you. All right, let's go ahead and let's do a quick joke before we move on.